Very good. Let me just introduce you very briefly. Friedemann Pulvermueller is professor of neuroscience of language and pragmatics and head of brain language laboratory of the Freie Universität Berlin. His main interest is in the neurobiological mechanisms enabling humans to use and understand language. The rest, I think, his focus is on active action-related mechanisms crucial for symbol understanding. So he's the first one who enters the topic of symbol grounding, which will also come up. Friedemann, welcome back. It's yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen, for inviting me again, and that's a great honor to speak to this large audience. Oh, welcome. Thank you very much for having me. I would speak on semantic grounding of concepts and meaning in brain-constrained neural networks. Can you hear me well?
We hear.
Yeah, very good. Just be back in case the connections gets worse. I had some bad experiences this morning. I hope it will be good. Okay, there are key questions of general interest to concepts about concepts in language. Well, you may disagree, you may not be interested in one or the other question, but at least these are the questions that interest me now for many years, and I wanted always to have questions, answers to them, and looked for ways to address those. Why are, for example, we able to use huge vocabularies of symbols while our closest relatives, our next neighbors in the evolutionary tree, use only a few signs, maximally 100 in their communication systems? Why is this so? Why are the mechanisms, what are exactly the mechanisms underlying semantic grounding? Well, and if we look at the brain, there are so many areas that are in some way or another important for semantics, and some of them are hub areas of general interest, others are only relevant for some semantic categories. Why is this so? I want an explanation of this. How can we build concepts and symbols related to objects and actions, and even whole categories of objects and actions? Why sometimes, what's the difference between a category term and just a label on an object? And then if we go further with regard to symbol complexity, what's the difference between concrete and abstract concepts, and how do we attach symbols to those concepts? And would there be the reverse effect, that symbols would actually enable concept formation? And is it possible that there is a mechanism behind that? And what is this mechanism? Now, I'll stop here. And I hope the one or the other of these questions are of interest to you too. When we started our neural networks projects, these were largely unanswered, or at least we were not clear about the best answer to give. And now I think, as I hope to show now in the talk, we have at least some candidate answers that make us think about possible mechanisms. Okay, and the idea behind it, the neural substrate may provide the explanation, or perhaps even an important an important contribution to the explanation. So, and this is based on the assumption that cognitive, linguistic, communicative abilities are based on concrete mechanisms and on a biological substrate, and it's obviously it's obviously so that the mechanistic properties of this substrate play a role here in building the cognitive abilities. We see that if there's a lesion of specific brain areas, then some of these abilities just get lost. And we also see that animals equipped with slightly different brains then suddenly have very different communication systems. So the substrate, the network of nerve cells seems to be, the underlying network seems to be crucial.
Friedemann, excuse me for the, are you under the impression that you're showing PowerPoints?
Yes, indeed.
There, you haven't shared.
Oh dear, this is This is, of course, I'm sure I pressed the buttons, but of course it can happen that it doesn't work. I'll try again. Is it there?
Now it works.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was just to underscore my what I've been saying so far. Not much lost if you didn't read the corresponding text. Let me just go on. And yeah, thanks for making me aware. I had pressed the buttons, but somehow it hadn't worked. Okay, and now you may say, well, we of course we can use neural networks and simulate this. And but here the question is whether neural networks, as we have them today, are sufficient for that. And and as you know, there's a huge neurocomputational research stream that developed in the last decade or so, where neural networks have been developed that correspond to different levels of brain activity and structure, from the whole brain level to the single cell and synaptic level and the circuit level in between. And all these neural networks have in common that they consist of elements that can be likened to neurons. Neurons, nerve cells in the brain. Here is a specimen, a pyramidal cell with its dendrites and its axons at the bottom. And in the simplest version of a neural model, of a neural neuron, of an artificial neuron, this comes as a unit that sums its inputs, compares it with a threshold, and sends out an output. Now these models can become more complicated, varying in the threshold function, for example, in the transfer function from the summed input to the output, and also the neural. The complexity of the neuron and even the modeling of the individual synapses can become extremely complex and also more closer to biology. If we look at those models that have been used and are used to model cognitive linguistic processes, then they come in different types, in different versions. Here, for example, the original connectionist models that were still symbolic and localist are shown here. Some of them are shown here. You typically have a word representation, a lexical representation in these models, connected, for example, with phonological and semantic features. But the similarity to the brain is not very great, as you may agree. Now, this is a bit better for distributed neuronal networks, where an input and an output layer and a hidden layer or several hidden layers are used to simulate learning. For example, the classification of an input, a string of words, or as shown here, a picture, and on the other hand of the network here, a deep neural network. And there are, for example, words that are used to classify these pictures, and these networks produce extremely accurate and performance, almost human-like performance in classifying pictures and into categories such as face, animal, tool, or whatever, or bird. So, but again, if we look at the architecture of these networks, they are not very close to brain structures. Well, the original perceptron with two layers here, with only two layers here, was actually fashioned according to the retina, a part of the brain. However, the area structure of the brain is not really well imitated by these deep neural networks. This is also so for the more powerful models developed in recent years, autoencoders here on the left, or transformers here on the right, they usually comprise a large number of areas or layers that feed into each other. They are, in many cases, just feed forward from one end to the other. And in this case of the autoencoder on the left, you see, for example, here a central compressed, very thin, very small layer with only a few neural units, which contrasts with the brain, where the association cortexes are usually much larger than the primary, the sensory and the motor areas. So also there's contrast to reality, but more recent developments and it also addressed this general similarity to the brain. Whole brain modeling, for example, takes it very seriously to implement the cortical areas and some subcortical nuclei as well, and also the connectivity structure linking those together. However, in this case, the disadvantage is that each area is only modeled by one neuron in the typical case, or by a very small set of neurons, and detail could be added there. In essence, whatever you do and wherever you look in the neural network literature, if it comes to cognition, what you have are networks that are similar to the brain at one level. For example, here in the connectivity, which is good for the whole brain models, the long distance connectivity, but it's lacking in most deep neural networks, and also, for example, regarding the mechanisms that go on within the areas. Here, the whole brain models are missing detail. So essentially, what we claim is now that we need to make networks more closer to the brain in order to guarantee compatibility. How else should we be able to model the difference between a monkey brain and a human brain, or the difference between different cortical areas in the brain if you ignore, for example, the area connectivity and area structure? Which levels, what features would one need to take into account? Of course, the neuron level, the single neuron level is important, but all neural networks do this already, to a degree. But then there's learning, the modification of the synaptic efficiency, and here we sometimes use backpropagation and rules whose realistic status with regard to in view of biology is under discussion, and other rules that are really taken from biology, such as Hebbian learning, what fires together wires together, and what is out of sync delinks. So we could indeed replace some of the learning rules in the network. We could also add local specificity. Normally, the deep neural networks have layers in which neurons sit side by side within each layer without any connection. So within the layers, there are no connections between the neurons in the typical case, but in the cortex, there's lots of connectivity within each area and within each local cluster of neurons. There are inhibitors, and also the excitatory neurons connect with each other through their basal dendrites and axon collaterals. And then, of course, at the macroscopic level, so to speak, we have the structure of areas in which the cortex is subdivided, and then the connections between these areas. All of these aspects seem to be relevant. So a brain-constrained modeling strategy might be to mimic indeed our area structure, brain connectivity, at different levels, at the local level, at the macro and microscopic level, at the within an area and between areas. We want to have excitatory and inhibitory neurons, locally connected, dynamic and globally connected, and also the learning should be kind of realistic regulation mechanisms. This is what results when you put together excitatory and inhibitory neurons, should also be implemented. And then, of course, we want to use the whole thing to model cognition. Well, but we can do this in different ways. And there have been very strong claims about how cognition is actually taking place in neural networks and thus the brain. And the two alternatives have been the proposal that indeed there are localist, discrete representation of words, syntactic rules, phonemes, and concepts and God knows what. And the competing view from the neural network literature is no, there are no such discrete localist representation, but the representation in neural networks and presumably all neural networks, including the brain, is that within an area and even across areas, each cognitive unit, like a word, a rule, is represented by an activation vector involving all the neurons in a fully distributed way, which of course leads into problems in activating two words at a time and so on and so forth. But these are two theoretical postulates which are kind of incompatible, or at least seen as incompatible, because we wanted to know how, in a more realistic perspective, things might look. We taught a simple brain-constrained network to learn words, and we did it in a very basic way. We taught the network just to do word production by activating some neurons here in the motor, articulatory motor cortex, and also at the same time some neurons in the auditory cortex in A1 of the model, and the neurons were supposed to correspond to and to represent the articulatory motor and also acoustic phonological features of the spoken word forms. Activation was on both sides of the network simultaneously. Activation was allowed to spread forward and backward. The connections were in both directions, bidirectional, and Hebbian learning was applied. What happens? Well, after a while, the backward and forward spreading of activation led to the formation of cell assemblies. Here, a very crude approximation. Here, more realistic display of the connected neurons and their links. And these had interesting functional properties. Here you see a display of the activation spreading that could be observed after stimulation of the auditory neurons that belong to one word representation. So the network was simulating spoken word understanding. You see activation first started here in the auditory system. Here each white dot represents one active neuron. Here it's pretty silent on the motor side. Activation was spreading slowly towards the middle of the network. Time is running from top to bottom. But after a while here, interestingly, a lot of activation was suddenly created. So after the stimulation phase, there was a full activation phase, and there was finally a phase where activation just faded out. And in the fade out process, these areas central to the architecture, the prefrontal cortex and the anterior temporal and the anterior parabelt here in the periphery of the superior temporal cortex, and held activation for the longest time. We can now we can describe these functional stages of activation and relate them to cognitive processes, word recognition and verbal working memory, maintenance of activity that in the word-related circuit. And what does this tell us about the nature of lexical representation? Is it localist or distributed? Well, the brief answer is it's both. It's not correct what has been claimed in the connectionist literature that there's just a distributed representation of cognitive units of words, for example, or of semantics, and without localist representations. We see that these cell assemblies form very similar to what Donald Hebb once claimed here in Montreal, or actually before he was, and we can even relate this the activations in this brain constraint network, which we observe, to different phases previously claimed to, namely that there's this ignition or recognition phase, and then later on a memory or reverberation phase. And all of this can be explained by Hebbian learning, indeed, and also by the strengthening of the connections between the part-taking neurons. Right. Good. But now let's look at the key questions previously introduced. Now you have, I hope you see them on the slide as well. And here I have 5 of them. Well, of course, you could increase the list to 20 more, but time is limited. And let's just go look at them one by one. Why are we able to learn huge vocabularies while apes and monkeys only use a few signs? Well, it's one possibility is that this relates to the wiring of the cortex of humans, of chimpanzees, of macaques here. And one difference that has been discussed as very prominent and very important, potentially very important, is this link from temporal and to frontal cortex and back through a fiber bundle called the arcuate fascicle. This connects the premotor and prefrontal areas to various temporal regions, and this is much stronger developed in humans than, for example, in chimpanzees or in macaques, in monkeys or in monkeys and chimpanzees generally. And if we can compare the connectivity, for example, here in this monkey display, you see that from prefrontal cortex, there's a link to posterior temporal cortex quite far from the auditory and the motor system. While in the human, connectivity structure, there is a link between several areas, prefrontal and premotor, to various temporal regions. We can translate this into a model, even though we can discuss about the details. In the monkey connectivity seems to primarily include next neighbor connections between the areas, and also one connection between anterior temporal and or between prefrontal and peripheral superior temporal regions. While in the human case, there seem to be more also jumping links, leaving one area while jumping over one or two of the areas in between. And what functional consequences would this connectivity structure difference, this evolutionary step from left to right, have in our brain constraint model? Well, you can see here the activation of the cell assembly formed in the monkey model when the monkey learned an ape call or a monkey cry. And you see the activations of the different areas here represented in different colors corresponding to the color of the boxes, and the areas here, the auditory cortex first, and then step by step it goes to frontal and to motor regions. And and activation comes up and goes down rather quickly. Now the dynamics in the human model is very different. You see activation here in the auditory cortex, and then as we saw it on the other activation, on the previous activation display, almost simultaneous activation of all the rest of the areas. So we have here a degree of parallelism in the activation process here. This looks still quite serial or cascaded. And we also see as a major difference that this one produces this kind of cell assembly in the human architecture, produces long-lasting reverberation of activity, while here the activation slope goes down right away. This is a display of how long activation was kept, and you see that the factor is about a factor of 2 or even higher than 2 to 4. So it's, I'm not saying that monkeys would not have any memory for spoken sounds, or they can produce, but I'm saying that the memory, this verbal working, this mouth-produced sound memory, is much better developed in the human brain due to an anatomical structural differences, the difference we implemented in this particular model. So why are we able to learn huge vocabularies? The additional jumping links lead to formation of more strongly connected cell assemblies, which can maintain activity for some time, and this provides a brain basis for verbal working memory, a specifically human feature, which is also necessary for vocabulary building, for vocabulary learning, as many language researchers agree. Right. Let's go to the next question. What are the mechanisms of semantic grounding? Why is there a variety of semantic brain areas, hub areas, and category-specific ones on the other side? Let me put more precisely what the findings to be explained are. Here we have a display of a brain of a patient who has semantic dementia here on the right, and you see the temporal lobes, anterior temporal lobes, have shrunk quite a lot. You see they are almost non-existent, and there's a lesion in bilateral temporal cortex. This patient and all semantic dementia patients at a progressed state have a general semantic problem with all kinds of words. So people therefore also speak about the semantic hub sitting in the anterior temporal lobe. And there are other areas for which similar claims have been made. But now there are also areas where there's a contribution to semantics, but maybe a smaller one, and one that primarily affects a specific type of word. Here, for example, a study by Damasio long ago showed that for certain lesions in temporal, more focal lesions in temporal cortex, there may be a problem, for example, with the processing of animal names specifically, or here for tool words. We could recently show that patients with very small, even with very small lesions in the motor system, have problems processing those. So it seems that there are category-specific semantic deficits related to lesions in various regions of the brain. Also we see this also in some auditory brain areas in parietal cortex. There have been parietal lesions observed to be related to preposition processing, for example, and so on and so forth. But then there are also the semantic hub areas of general relevance for the brain. Why is this so? We didn't fully understand this, and even our early models we developed would not have been able to explain the full range of these phenomena. But then we addressed this with modeling with brain constraints models, which were now a little bit more complex in their structure. It's still not a whole brain model, but a model in which at least some part of not only the perisylvian language cortex here in blue and red was modeled, but also some dorsal motor and prefrontal cortices and some temporal visual processing stream parts. So, and this model was now taught animal words, for example, or object-related words, and then action-related words, such as grasp or dog here. And again, the auditory phonological features and the articulatory phonological features were coded, of the word forms were coded in the perisylvian auditory and motor cortex, and in visual cortex, the input coded for visual features of the visual shapes of dogs here. We did not attempt to also implement the barking and the smell of the dog and things like that. This was just, we were just considering this visual entity. This is a word with a visual referent, and also in the case of action words, we coded here movements, movement trajectories, and muscle movements of the actual action, and these were activated then together with the word form representations in the perisylvian part of the network, and here the extrasylvian part. Yeah, right. And here you see what happened in the network as a result of the learning of the object and the action-related words. You can see here a lot of activation in the central regions, where in these convergence zones, there are associated association cortices of the model, and you see a little activation in the peripheral areas, in the sensory motor areas, and also interestingly, these were category specific. Here you see only blue dots, here only red dots. The blue dots stand for neurons belonging to an object word cell assembly, and the red dots are neurons, artificial neurons in the model of action word cell assemblies. Yellow are those neurons that happen to be part of both. Yeah, and you can of course put this in a nicer display, also showing the distribution of the areas across the brain and the cortex, and you can do statistics of the neuron, of the number of neurons per area, and you can see here in the visual system we get a huge predominance of object word cell assembly neurons, and here in the motor system the other way around, the action word cell assembly neurons predominate. So this is statistically highly significant, and thus we can proceed to an explanation. And the explanation, and one part of the explanation is that the semantic hubs are those areas where this lots of activation is produced. Why is this activation here in the central areas? Because of the huge convergence of these areas. You remember that each of these areas got input from various sides. There was a lot of convergence on these areas. Therefore, lots of accumulation of activation, and the more activation there is, the more firing and wiring together, and therefore the larger density of semantic neurons here in these cell assemblies, in these central hub areas of the networks. So these areas become semantic hubs because they are connector hubs, because they are convergence zones, receive a lot of activation that can correlate. But we also can explain the other observation, that of category specific areas. This is because stimulation is a relevant information that needs to be linked, is transmitted through those areas. Visual cortex, we need to learn, we need to ground our knowledge about the knowledge of meaning of the word dog into real world experiences, and this happens partly through the visual modality. In the case of grasping, is an important issue here is to relate it to action patterns, actions performed, bodily actions performed by the person themselves. So the explanation here is why are there a variety of semantic brain areas, hubs and category-specific ones. Correlated neural activity in sensory and motor areas drives the formation of symbol grounding in object and action word processing, dependent on the semantics of the specific symbols. Neurons in different sensory motor areas are active. Therefore, model has a category-specific role. And then the correlated activity in modal areas converges on well-connected hub areas, anatomical connector hubs, where neuronal activation accumulate, and this leads to the high density of assembly neurons and to the emergence of semantic hubs, for example, in anterior temporal lobe. A side remark, we can provide here explanations for at the cognitive level by looking at the underlying neurobiological model by the mechanisms or the simulated mechanisms. There's always a possibility that the simulations are still not good enough and need to be further improved. And I'm waiting for your comments on that. But then there's the Hebbian learning procedure here, which explains the circuit formation and also the distribution of the circuits across different areas of the model, and this can be used then to explain the cognitive observations. Another question: is language an important factor in concept formation or even necessary for it? And this also relates to the question about the difference between abstract and concrete concepts and words. Let's just look at grounding of concepts and semantics more closely. If we learn the word form I, we may relate this to a visual, or the word dog in the previous example. Now the word I as a thing we can actually perceive. Then we may see activation of a word form representation in perisylvian cortex, co-activating with a visual percept, with a bunch of neurons in the ventral visual stream, and that relates to the perception of the related object, an eye, for example. But of course, the different neurons here respond to very different things. There may be simple sensor surround cells in the visual cortex. There may be complex feature detectors that respond to a constellation of lines and shapes, and there may be some neurons that respond to rather complex entities. For example, here a blurred version of an approximate eye shape. Now these may be differently engaged in concept learning and in word learning, because of course, if I see this particular eye, there are specific features of this eye which are not relevant and which are not so that in other cases of perceiving eyes, the respective neurons may not be activated. For example, the neurons that respond to eye color here, they seem to be rather idiosyncratic, and they may only activate with one instance of the concept, but not generally. However, other features, such as the thing that is usually a round thing and a fine line around it, one of these neurons might become active whenever eyes are being perceived, and therefore, if we learn the word form, may be linked into the semantic network. So these shared features might be of specific relevance here. And if we, next slide, if we now look at the situation, what we could consider those neurons here in the middle, the overlap neurons, as semantic insofar as they represent the shared features of the different instances of the concept, and those become active together whenever one of the instances is being perceived, and therefore they fire together a lot and wire together and form a conceptual cell assembly. Now, if we look at abstract concepts, the patterns are, the situation is much more complicated. If you think of a concept such as beauty, then they are very different. One may say beauty is something that exists in open air, but from a grounding perspective, you may argue, no, we actually experience different instances of beauty, but these are very, very different physically, perceptually. And so how can we learn that there's a concept? For example, these are 3 examples of beautiful things that are normally seen as beautiful. But if you look at the features, the physical visual features, their overlap across the 3 is actually 0. And if you look at pairwise comparisons, there is a little bit of similarity. There's something round in the center of those 2. There's a fine line curved in these 2. So there's a little bit of overlap, there's a little bit of sharing of features, but no generally shared features. So and we call this, following Wittgenstein, a pattern of family resemblance. So there's no general feature overlap, but the feature overlap is only partial. As in a family, some family members may resemble each other, but others may look very different from each other. Yeah, and here the bad thing is that the correlation between these 3, between the activation of these partially shared neurons is actually very bad. If you ask how high the probability is if these different instances just appear equally probably, then you see that the probability of co-activation of each of these neurons is just 1/3 of their activations. Now, in these shared neurons, they are active together whenever one of these perceptions take place, whenever one of these objects instances are being perceived. So here we have a probability of 1, here 1/3. That may not be sufficient for concept formation, for formation of a strongly connected circuit. Now, these probabilities change if we add a word form. If we not so much in the case of the concrete word, because if each time the object appears, the word is now used, which rarely happens, but may happen in some cases, and I just use this for exhibition to calculate the numbers, then we may still end up with a probability of 1 and a very strong cell assembly, therefore uniting the word form with the concept and building a semantic circuit. Now here, the probability is at least twice as high that one of these 3 neurons co-activates with the word form. Why is this so? Just think about it. You hear this word together with this, together with this, together with this. Now, in these 3 cases, this neuron is active twice. So we have a 2/3 probability in this simplistic example. But of course, with more sophisticated examples, the relationship of the probabilities stay the same. In essence, this word form addition here has a functional contribution. It enhances the correlation of neural activity, or In other words, these semantic features can bind together by way of the word form. The word form is a correlation enhancer and this may help the building of abstract concepts. We modeled this, and the modeling is quite complex, and my time is, I think, running out. Or how I am with time, Steve, may I ask? Sorry? Hello?
Yes,
Okay.
It's you had 45 minutes by default, but you can take an hour and leave a half hour for discussion.
But are my 45 minutes up already?
The time right now is 40. Well, it's 47 minutes, but it's okay. Keep going until.
Okay, let's give me 5 more minutes. Okay, sure. So the brain constraint model. I will not go into the details then. Indeed, the concept, but I will summarize what came out with in the modeling when we did model these the learning of abstract and concrete concepts, and also then the effect of adding a label for these concepts. So the concrete concepts build conceptual representations easily when experiencing category instances, different types of eyes, for example, due to shared features and strong correlation of shared feature neuron activations. Then abstract concepts, however, such as freedom or beauty, they did not build representations from experience with instances. And this was because they only partially shared features and resultant, and therefore low correlation between semantic feature neuron activations resulted, as already explained. Now, when adding the labels, when adding words for abstract and concepts, this facilitates both concrete and abstract concept formation, but is much more essential and in this model even necessary for the latter, or abstract concept formation, due to relatively higher correlation between category label and partially shared semantic feature neuron activations. So compared with correlation across the partly shared semantic feature neurons activated. So, this correlation enhancing function of the labels were documented also in the simulations. This is from my colleague Finn Dobler, and the activations here of the different types of semantic cell assemblies. Here for the abstract concepts, there was very little activation, and for the concrete concepts learned in isolation without language, there was a little bit more activation at the peak, but then the big difference is here in the memory behavior. You can see that that activation lasts for quite some time here in arbitrary time, displayed in arbitrary time steps. But the important thing is that the abstract concept, it did not have any memory. You may argue that here it takes four time steps until activation goes down to the 0 line again. But you have to consider also that the network has 6 areas from input to the end. So the pathway from the input to the other end, the farthest other end of the network, is indeed 5 time steps, and you can see there's very little activation here after 5 time steps, and after this activation just flowing through the network one way, there's nothing left, no maintenance of activation. This is just feed forward, an activation wave running feed forward through the network. While here in the conceptual representation of the concrete concept, there is a maintenance of activation for many more time steps. When we add a verbal support for these concepts, we see much stronger activation, whose peak is delayed also, and also an even longer activation and maintenance. So, in essence, the conclusion from this, we cannot learn. Our neural network suggests we cannot learn abstract concepts unless we have verbal labels that support them. While for concrete concepts, there's also a benefit of language, but it's not an all or nothing thing, and it's just a more efficient and more long-lasting, memory-intensive process that comes about with the labels. Okay, so I promised you to stop in 5 minutes. Let me just summarize. It may be useful to brain constrain neural networks at multiple levels, from the single cell to local circuit to global area and connectivity levels, to explain various things. Why humans but not monkeys have verbal working memory and huge vocabularies, how grounding works, and semantic grounding and symbol grounding, and and why the brain develops category specific as well as the general semantic hub areas, and then to explain the formation of abstract conceptual representation, which made and then also to explain the influence of language on cognition at a fine-grained scale, and finally, of course, to clarify the nature of neuronal representation in the brain. And we suggest that it's both symbolic discrete and distributed probabilistic. Right. This is to thank my collaborators. I mentioned already Finn Dobler here, Thomas Wennekers, with whom I started the whole project 20 years ago in Cambridge, Malte Schomas, who did most of the abstract concrete simulations. More recently, Finn has joined him, and he's now carrying on this project. Rosario Tomasello, who has been instrumental in this in the simulation of semantic grounding, already starting 5 years ago, and then Maxime Carrière, who was in his PhD project and looking at the role of the arcuate fascicle, for example. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Right, thanks so much for this panoramic talk. Now I give it over to your discussant, your designated discussant, whom you already know.
All right, hi all. So yeah, thanks Professor Pulvermueller for a really excellent, this is really, I think, inspiring and intuitive view of how abstract concepts form through language. Basically, concepts are correlated bundles of features, and for abstract concepts, the only thing that correlates them is the labels that you're seeing. I've got a few comments and questions and thoughts on this, which I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, and maybe from the whole group as well. So yeah, so the idea is that abstract concepts are forming because basically of the labels that were given to them through language. And this really raises this idea of, the Whorfian hypothesis for cognition and language. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that the language you speak can affect the thoughts that you think. So like the idea is, if you have a language that somehow doesn't have a word for like time, maybe the way you think about time is somewhat different. It seems to me that this view of concept formation is basically driven by labeling. That suggests that language has a huge influence on thought. There might be abstract concepts that are just inaccessible to you unless you are basically taught them by language. And I just wonder how far you are willing to go with that idea. Because so the experimental support for the influence of language on cognition is it appears to exist in some areas and not other areas. It's a bit of a mixed literature. Another sort of high level point or question is, So you're asking the question of why humans have huge vocabularies. How is it that the brain supports language learning in humans, but not in any other animal? And it seems it has to do with jumping links that allow more densely connected cell assemblies to represent words, both in their acoustics and their meanings. What I wonder is, like, what's the interplay of form and function here? To what extent might we have something like a chicken and egg issue here? So, like, is it that the neural structures we have as humans enable us to learn large vocabularies and language, or is it that the fact that we have to learn large vocabularies has shaped the neural architecture over evolutionary time? So relatedly, like, if you see the brain as just like a general optimizer, you can imagine that the brain will find some solution to the problem of learning large vocabularies. Maybe it will involve jumping links, maybe it will involve something else. A very interesting question is, to what extent does the architecture truly constrain the form of language? Or is it just the architecture is responding to something else in the structure of language? A third interesting point I'd like to make is that I think the work here that you've presented on this question of local versus distributed representations of words, it's very closely related to recent work on interpretability in large language models. So there's been a lot of interest lately in trying to figure out if you can identify any particular neuron in a large language model like GPT-3 as corresponding to a concept like a word. And one of the very interesting insights from that work is that sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can find like the grandmother neuron that only responds to the concept of a grandmother inside of a large language model. Sometimes you can't. But it actually, there's been an insight in the interpretability literature where they've found that to some extent, there's no real difference between a localist representation and a distributed one. So a distributed representation where a concept like grandmother is spread out over multiple activations of multiple neurons, that could just correspond to, if you're thinking about the activation of neurons as a vector, a distributed representation and a local representation just correspond to using different bases to write that vector in that mathematical vector space. And it turns out in terms of like the mathematical predictions from a model, there's no privileged basis. There's no reason to favor one basis in terms of what counts as a neuron over another. You can sort of rotate the space of activations and in artificial neural networks and get the same behavior. And so an interesting question is, to what extent is that true in biological networks? Like, to what extent does it really matter in biological networks that it is, you know, one neuron as opposed to a distribution over neurons? Does this idea of basis independence hold in any way in biological networks? Those are just some of my thoughts, questions. I'd be curious to know what you think.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is fantastic. Thank you very much for these very deep questions. Can I just go ahead and answer one by one? Yeah. Okay. You're absolutely right that, of course, what I'm saying here, that language should have, or the model would say that the language might have a strong influence on concept formation, is something that would be that was very popular in the linguistic relativity school of thought already. However, if you look at Wolff or also at von Humboldt, you would not see an answer to the question, why is this so? They would just say language is such, has this magic ability of determining our thoughts, and it has and influencing our perceptions. Why this is so is not explained, and the explanatory question is in the center of our research. So this is, it's indeed true that this is, of course, then in the tradition of Wolff and von Humboldt and also more recent people who actually accumulated evidence. However, the evidence, as you rightly pointed out, is quite mixed. Some of the results especially about perception, and influence of language and perception is quite mixed. The Russian blues of Winnower 2008 are not always replicated. However, they are more, but all this research is also characterized by an abundance of grossly bad studies, simply because this is a so complicated issue that it's very difficult to address experimentally. They, for example, compared people in most of the studies compared people from different cultures speaking different languages. And of course, if Russians then suddenly distinguish between shades of blue more effectively than other color distinctions, you may see that this relates rather to the way of their way of living, or maybe to 1,000 other things, but their language. So what we need in this domain very, very urgently is good experimental paradigms. And we and others have indeed used such well-controlled experimental paradigms where we teach adults new languages, or at least partly some parts of the language. My colleague Telly Miller here at Freie Universität has done a series of experiments on this and found that if we very tightly control, for example, the ability to distinguish sensory patterns applied to the digit to one of your fingers, you may not be able to discriminate very fine differences, but with language support you will. And this has meanwhile be replicated in other labs, for example, by Majid, and in other modalities also. And this seems to be a rather strong indication that language can impact on perception. So far to the mixed evidence, it is indeed mixed, but there's also some strong supportive evidence meanwhile, even though Pinker was actually quite negative about the approach, I think. But of course, we need to be open to experimental results. Next point, you asked about what constrained what. So the hen and egg problem, so to speak. Well, generally in evolutionary biology, the idea is that we have a certain set of abilities, and if this is useful in the environment for survival and for well-being and God knows what, then you may maintain it. You may just reproduce more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So it seems we cannot assume that there was a need at one stage to produce more words, and then that the arcuate fascicle suddenly grew out of bounds. This would be very naive. This would be this would not be as following Darwinian evolution theory. We would actually assume that there were random mutations that produced apes with slightly different arcuate fascicles, and therefore they may have learned a little bit, a few more symbols, a few more signs, and that was an advantage to them because they could communicate more efficiently, and then it grew a little bit more, and this was another advantage. And finally, there was a really sick thing, and that also enabled working memory, and then suddenly there was an explosion of the vocabulary after verbal working memory was obtained. So what is constraining here is, I think, the evolutionary progression. But then, of course, the model needs to be under constraints of what the brain actually has. We cannot use a deep neural network or a ChatGPT kind of architecture to model the arcuate fascicle, because there is no correlate of any arcuate fascicle in this type of model. We need to make the models biological. That's my point. Finally, large language model sometimes have word representations and sometimes don't. Well, that's the problem of these models because they are not biologically realistic. They have, if you look at, for example, a deep convolutional network, they have feed-forward connection, which is not so biologically realistic. They have topographical projections, so one neuron projects not to the entire next layer, only to a local neighborhood. This is very biologically realistic. This is exactly how the brain works. There are topographical projections all over the place, but then the area structure, as I said before, is not exactly what we want in the what you have in the brain, and also importantly, the connections within each area, they have no analog in this kind of model. There's no inhibition within each each layer, and these are the factors, as our work indicates, that lead to the fully distributed nature developing in this kind of models. But this is not biologically realistic. If we add local connections, we get discrete circuits, and those have the advantage of then allowing us to represent two words in one layer. So because if you have full vector representations and you activate two of those at the time, you get interference, and you cannot. And that's a big problem of this kind of model, and it works much better in these cell assembly models. So essentially, I would say whatever happens in large language models, as long as they are not very much constrained by more biological features, we shouldn't take this too seriously. Also, I do not want to speak against the doubtlessly great achievements of some simulations. For example, Krieger's courses, simulations of the visual stream, which can be seen as a cascade of several area activations. What is, I think, very instructive for explaining the difference between perceptual and cognitive conceptual representations. Sorry, a long answer to many questions. Are there other? Thank you. Thanks so much. Stephen, are there more questions, or is my time up?
Let me just see if there's so many different threads here. I have to find out whether there are any. Are there? If you have questions from here, you can raise your hand. If you're out in panelists, you can just talk. Okay. Oh, Stephen Hansen raises. Okay, so go ahead, Steve Hansen. Go. Can you show his face?
He has to show his face.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Hi. Oh, there I am. That was a wonderful, this masterful tutorial from very simple kind of connectionist and neural network kind of modeling into brain structure and brain imaging. You managed not to bring up resting state, which I think is probably a good idea in this case, but the overall structure of the story relative to the LLMs, the chatbots, you keep stressing the idea that there has to be a biological kind of context for everything, that the back propagation isn't biological. And of course, this has gone on for 50 years, and yet it is the engine behind all this. It makes one wonder, if clearly the brain is structured, and clearly these LLMs are not structured. They have a very simple feed-forward structure. They have these attention heads, which are autoregressive, probably recurrent. And if we think of the brain, let's say the cerebellum, as a prediction simulation engine in the cerebellum, which is trying to make some kind of first order sketchy simulation of what's about to happen and why the context is this and so on. We think of the LLMs also creating something that looks like 50 to 100 million contexts. Let's call them clusters of words, roughly, in your sense, that some might have features that are overlapping, some might be more Wittgensteinian, more family resemblance, and so on. There's something about the lack of structure in all this, and the fact that we're using, and I don't disagree that, you know, backpropagation has some biological issues. I think there's ways to regularize it, but generally, pretty much everything about this is non-biological. So your claim that it has to be biological to work seems not very effective.
Okay, time for a reply.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what I should say. Of course, I'm criticizing that not many models are not very biological, even though this is, of course, not an argument against their achievements. If large language models are feed-forward and the brain is not feed-forward, or is rarely, the cortex at least, is not feed-forward, then this is not an argument against the achievement of the generative pre-trained transformers. These are very efficient machines to solve tasks, but they are not very good tools for answering questions about why the brain does things as it does. This is simply the point I'm making, and I think it, for me personally, it's quite exciting to try to answer questions about the brain, difficult questions about the brain, by using neural networks as toys in this explanatory game. And here, GPT is not so useful. But I cannot say that well, this shouldn't be misunderstood as a general criticism. And certainly, if something works very well and works different from the brain, it's still a useful thing for various things.
Okay, thank you.
Only not so much for explaining the brain. And I would still doubt that even backpropagation must be a principle that is realized in the brain. It's probably there are analogies and similarities between Hebbian learning and error backpropagation, but exactly as it's done in backpropagation, where an error signal is required, it's difficult to reconcile,
Okay.
I think.
Steve, do you want to do a quick repartee? Because Gary.
I agree in general, although I think the problem here is at the behavioral level. What we're seeing is something that appears to be producing at least a context-free grammar. And this has destroyed poverty of the stimulus. This has destroyed our obvious kinds of language networks that we understand, aphasias and other kinds of problems. It's just completely destructive to the thesis that the biological nature of the structure of the brain is anything we have correct.
Okay, that's an assertion. Friedemann, that one has to be answered by Roni Katsir. But go ahead, and then I'll let Gary speak.
Are you saying I should say again?
Yes, go ahead, but it needs to be answered by the people who are actually.
Only one point. You speak about poverty of the stimulus. Now the problem, as I would see it, the problem of large language models is that they get much more evidence than any human being would get in their lives, and especially.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
And that's unrealistic, and also from a linguistic perspective, makes these models less interesting, because you cannot be sure whether the rare construction they are processing has been experienced by them.
Sure.
Okay,
so it's not general. Whether it's
Yes,
generalization or not, you don't know. Sorry.
Let me cut that off. That'll be taken up by the linguists and the computer scientists. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Thank you, Friedemann. Yeah, I wanted to say two things. One, sort of in kind of response to Richard's comment, who of course made the correct inference that the view you're presenting overlaps some extent with the Whorfian position, and I just wanted to add that perhaps the best evidence in favor of language having this effect on our conceptual representations, and it's not so much comparing languages, although as Friedemann, as you and Richard also pointed out, the evidence is mixed, but comparing language to no language. So whenever humans are deprived of language or even have reduced linguistic experience, the cognitive consequences are enormous, much, much more than what you see in cases of sensory deprivation. So a blind child is cognitively much better off than a deaf child who's deprived of language. A deaf child who's exposed to the proper linguistic input through sign, for example, is cognitively fine. So that's one point. And the other point, Friedemann, I wanted to push back a bit on the part about comparing chimps and humans and vocabulary. It seems that, as Terry Deacon and others have pointed out, that the mystery is not why don't other languages, other animals have complex languages, it's why they don't have language at all. And so in appropriate cases, in cases of human-reared chimps, for example, chimps can learn fairly large vocabularies. Dogs can as well. They're not motivated to do so, and that's kind of where it seems to be the rub. So a lot of the cognitive machinery to learn, signs for things seems to be there. It just requires the kind of training and experiences that children don't need because they're intrinsically motivated to learn this stuff. And so I'm wondering how you make sense of these animal language learning experiments that show that a lot of the cognitive capacities are latent. They're there. They're just not really used in nature for reasons that seem to have less to do with kind of hard limits on, cognitive capacities or cortical wiring.
You don't know?
Well, I think if you look at the great apes, is my microphone still working?
Yes, it's working. Fine.
If you look at these experiments with the great apes, they were trained for an entire life with symbol use, and it was not spoken words, of course. I'm speaking specifically about spoken words, but there were complicated machinery with symbols on the buttons and God knows what, and it was not possible to get them above a level of 200-300 symbols, so which contrasts with the 40,000 or 100,000 symbols humans learn easily. I'm not sure whether this difference, this quantitative difference, is easily explained by motivation or I think these MIT researchers training them, the animals did their best to motivate them, and I'm not sure motivation is the only the best the final explanation here.
Gary, fight
In the case.
Well, a language that's a few hundred words is still, it's a simple language, but it can be a language, but you don't find even that in the wild. So like the argument isn't that, provided the right training, chimps can learn 40,000 words. It's they can learn a lot more and systems that are much more language-like than they actually use in the wild. And it's not just chimps, so many animals can. And but the fact that they don't do so in the wild, right? That's the point. Speaks to so I agree with you that motivation might not explain the gap between a few hundred or 1,000 and 40,000, but you can have a pretty powerful linguistic system with just a few hundred symbols.
Yeah, sure. Of course, we can have a powerful linguistic system with just a 0 and a 1.
Well, but cognitively, what matters are the chunks, right? It's what you do with it. So we're not talking like elementary units.
But aren't the number of chunks then a good criterion for distinguishing simple and complex if the chunks are so important?
Yes. Oh, yeah, I agree with that, but
then
you
I
don't
would
find simple
doubt that.
languages, yeah, in other animals. And you know, a language with a few hundred words is certainly simpler, but it's something. But you don't really find that. So I'm just saying that like whatever limitation in learning large vocabularies is perhaps not the central kind of constraint that's relevant for explaining why other animals don't have what we call natural language.
As moderator, I'm allowed to say a word here, and I think that you're making, in counting the words, both of you. I mean, Friedemann is saying it could be just 0 and 1, and Gary is counting the words. You may be looking at the wrong thing. It's not the words, it's the capacity to make a proposition with truth values that might be missing. And in Gary's direction, in Gary's point of view, the capacity, even for that, may be there, but and it can be learned. In principle, it can be learned. You can show it with a machine, but it isn't clear that it's learnable is enough. You also have to have the motivation to learn it.
Yes, I would agree. You have to have the motivation to learn it, and of course, in the human social communicative context, there's a lot of motivation for that. I'm absolutely with you that there are other factors than the arcuate fascicle.
But the motivation is not cultural, it's biological. The children who go through their naming explosion do it just as a matter of course. It's not because they have a taste for naming that they've developed.
Well, but they do all their language use is actually a social activity. And they exchange with, they communicate and exchange and exchange and interact from the first word on.
Okay. Moderators have the right to intervene, but not very long. I withdraw. Steve, do you still have your hand up? No? Because lunchtime is looming.
I don't know. I think, yeah, there's a lot more to talk about, but it's going to take a lot longer than we have.
We have 9 more days, 3 more sessions today. Okay, thank you very much for attending this session. Have a good lunch. You don't have very long to have your lunch. And be back.
Thank you so much.
Peux-tu arrêter la l'enregistrement? Okay, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much. See you later.
Thank you. Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Flustered moderators, we get to thank their speakers.